Today we're going to discuss the most infamous case of human beings being abducted by aliens. Now, before you roll your eyes, this is the first case to ever receive national and international attention, and that's due to the two individuals at the center of the story and their very earnest testimonies. This is the case of Betty and Barney Hill. Welcome to the cemetery. I'm former gravedigger Nathan Barnett from spooky old New England, living in Los Angeles, and you're watching Grave Stories. I'm not at all in a cemetery. I don't know why that's in there. I guess it's because I started that intro when I was doing the podcast and you couldn't see where I was. I was recording the audio in a closet, but I could have been in a cemetery. But now that I'm doing these as a video series, I am clearly not in a cemetery. Either way, welcome and thank you for being here. Now, before I get into this, I will ask that you please like this video, because I'm sure you already like it before we even gotten into it, and subscribe if you don't mind, because I could really use the boost. I've been on this website for way too long and I'm trying to get somewhere with my life. Also, I will ask you to please go and watch Tinfoil Tom's videos and subscribe to him. He makes very similar spooky investigation videos of paranormal and strange topics. He wrote this episode with me. Tom wrote the first draft and then I got my hands on it and wrote the second draft. So please go check out Tom's channel and thank him for helping me with this episode. Now, since Tom and I wrote this together, there's been a lot of changes and I don't have this one down in my head. So I'm pretty much just going to be looking at the screen and reading what we wrote. So without further ado, let's get into the case of Betty and Barney Hill. In 1961, Patsy Cline and Roy Orbison dominated the radio. John F. Kennedy was sworn in as the 35th President of the United States, and dads all over the globe celebrated the miraculous achievement of cordless power tools. But for Betty and Barney Hill, 1961 would mark the most important day of their lives, the day they became America's first verified UFO abductees, and one of, if not the first case, of missing time on record, and defined what would become a keystone case in unidentified aerial phenomena. September 19th, 1961. Betty and Barney Hill sat in a roadside diner in Vermont on their way back home from their honeymoon trip, a weekend in Niagara Falls, capped off with a swing through Montreal. It was a very last-minute trip, but the Hills didn't know when they would get a chance again to go away. It was so last-minute, in fact, that the Hills had already spent most of the money that they had with them, about $70. They'd forgotten to go to the bank prior to this impromptu holiday. And in the old days, you couldn't just go to an ATM. Regardless, they were here now, staring across at each other at a diner table in a nearly empty diner along Route 3. Stopping to recharge before getting in the car again, Betty had a piece of chocolate cake and Barney had a burger, and they had shared a cup of coffee. It was a long drive home back from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where the Hills called home, and this stop was a much-needed break before they started the drive again after crossing the Canadian border into the United States. At this rate, it would be several hours still before they reached their destination. They had to head out soon to beat the approaching storm that they heard about on the car radio a while back when driving. Now, Barney was a postal worker, and he had recently taken the night shift to be closer to home, commuting some 60 miles each way to the post office in Boston. It was the closest office that he could find work in nearby, and the schedule was really hard on him. Betty was a social worker with a full caseload. Both were civil rights advocates who fought for civil rights in a time when it was more dangerous to do so. They were also an interracial couple, and this getaway was a time that they could finally celebrate their recent marriage and just be with each other away from prying eyes. Things were looking bright for the newlyweds, and they planned to keep fighting for the rights of everyone in the future so no one had to face the hardships that they did. So this late night meal was well earned and might be the last time they'd get to spend a weekend like this together for a while. They looked at the clock in the diner and it read 10:05 p.m. They finished up and headed back on the road. The drive back was uneventful for a while. That is until Betty began to observe what appeared to be a star alongside them. But it was acting strange. It was moving with them. It continued to get brighter and move rather erratically. This, of course, was concerning. Was it an airliner in the distance, a meteor, a helicopter? Barney insisted it must be a satellite or a star, but maybe some sort of new plane. To Betty, it would appear that whatever it was following them. She swore it was getting brighter and brighter and closer and closer. It was late at night, and this stretch of road was quiet anyway, but at this time of night and at this time of year, it was absolutely desolate. The hills were growing more and more alarmed. Around 11 p.m., Barney pulled over into a picnic area to get a closer look. The hills argued over what it might be. Now looking through a pair of binoculars, Barney swore it was a plane or a helicopter. "It's gotta be a plane," he said, growing more and more frustrated. Delcy, the couple's dog, begun to get really nervous, so they got back in the car. They were anxious at this point. Barney, more in possible denial over what they saw. Betty knew this object wasn't a plane. Its movements were too peculiar. Its shape was foreign, unlike anything they'd ever seen before. And Barney was in the military, so he should know better. It had strange lights emanating from it. Barney still denied it was anything more than an ordinary aircraft. But maybe it was military. Experimental aircraft. A new type of fighter jet. They are always developing something new and exciting these days, he may have thought. They drove on, slowly, passing a motel, a sign of life, but they continued to drive on the isolated road. Betty, wide-eyed by this point, the round object like a pancake, was now almost above them and seemed to be spinning. Lights began to emerge from the craft. She saw what she thought were rows of windows on whatever it was. "Are we being watched?" Betty thought. Betty said to Barney, "Barney, you've got to stop. We've never seen anything like this in our life." Barney, who had at this point realized the absolute enormity of the craft as he looked through the car window as it descended ever closer in their direction, pulled the car over, almost in the center of the road. He leaned out of the car and said, "Betty, all right, give me the binoculars." This was almost certainly not a regular aircraft. At this point, the craft hovered no more than 100 feet above them, dead silent, and it was huge. The glowing pancake shape, as they would later describe it, was taking up nearly the entire field of vision. The couple, wide-eyed, stared at whatever this was. Betty yelled, "Do you see it? Do you see it?" Barney was understandably, at this point, losing his cool and becoming very alarmed. He had taken his pistol and put it in his pocket for protection. By all accounts, Barney was a loving family man, and he was not about to let whatever this was cause him or Betty harm. He slowly stepped out of the car and carefully crept towards the craft, as if compelled to do so by some otherworldly unseen force. Betty yelled out, "Barney, you damn fool, get back here!" The craft was now hovering silently directly in front of Barney, straight ahead, down the road, entirely preventing them from going any further. He continued walking towards the craft, slowly, binoculars still glued to his face in disbelief. He then confirmed what Betty had thought she'd seen, a row of windows, or what seemed to be windows on the pancake-shaped craft, with what seemed to be 11 humanoids staring down at them in the midst of some sort of preparation. Bright red lights were activated and wings protruded from the sides of what he knew now to be a ship. It was no ordinary aircraft, though. It was a flying saucer. Barney was by then gripped with an incredible fear. He knew they were about to be abducted. After locking eyes with one of the beings as if subconsciously being told something he didn't quite understand, and managed to lower the binoculars and free himself from whatever had frozen him for a moment and begun to run full sprint back towards the car. They had to get out of there, fast. Barney was in full panic mode. As Betty would later write, "At this point, my husband became shocked and got back in the car in a hysterical condition, laughing and repeating, 'They're going to capture us.' The motor had been left running, so he began driving the car. Barney put it into drive and began to rip down the road at a high speed, frantically trying to escape whatever this was that they had just seen. Had they lost whatever it was? Where did the craft go? Then, suddenly, from behind them, the hills heard a beep, 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 and they fell into a haze, lulled into a semi-conscious state of drowsiness, and it all went dark. The next thing Betty and Barney remembered is snapping back into reality somewhere near Ashland and hearing a recent distinct set of beeps. They were some 35 miles from where they had last clearly remembered being. What had happened? How did they get here? Why couldn't they remember anything? All they knew was they had heard a set of beeps, one where they had pulled over to observe the craft and one just now, near Ashland. The couple, who had been silent, were finally seemingly able to speak again. Snapping out of their trance, Betty turned to Barney and said, "Now do you believe in flying saucers?" When the Hills finally arrived home, morning light streaked across the sky. But how could this be? Surely only a few minutes had passed. But they seemed to be missing roughly 2 hours of time. They both checked their watches. Both watches had stopped. When they got inside, they looked at the kitchen and baffled to read it was 5 a.m. Barney looked at Betty and said, "It looks like we arrived home a little later than expected." The Hills agreed to not talk about this event to anybody. Who would believe them? This was a time when you might get institutionalized for talking about this kind of thing. But it was clear they'd experienced something out of this world on their long night drive. They weren't just tired as others would suggest. Things were just off. Clothing they had on was scuffed or ripped beyond repair. The strap on the binoculars had snapped clean in two. Weird circles were seen on the trunk of the car, and placing a compass near it would cause the needle to spin wildly out of control. Totally magnetized. Their watches had stopped at around the time of the encounter, and what of the missing time? Where did those 2 hours go? Why couldn't they remember what happened? Even though the Hills felt they shouldn't tell anyone, how could they not? They had to tell someone. What if this was an invasion or something? So on September 21st, Betty reported the incident to the Pease Air Force Base, who did interview the Hills. But the military did what they usually do and told them it was probably just Jupiter and they had misidentified whatever they had seen that evening. To the Air Force's credit, they did forward the case to Project Blue Book, the official military investigation into UFOs at the time. But as far as the Air Force was concerned, they either didn't believe or wouldn't believe the Hills' fantastic story, at least officially. Betty, right around this time, also started to experience horrible reoccurring dreams or visions while she was sleeping. She wondered if these were fragmented, missing memories of the event, and she began to write them down in a journal. Was this the missing time? In her dreams, she remembered being led onto the craft with Barney, who was in a trance-like state, by gray humanoid-like creatures who wore black, plain, military-like uniforms. Once on board, they were examined and samples were taken of their hair, skin, nails, and a horribly painful test specifically to Betty. It was performed by thrusting a needle, or as she described it, the biggest needle she'd ever seen, directly into her navel, which the examiner, as she called him, simply waved off the pain for her, and it made it stop as she cried out from the shock of it. She was also shown some sort of a book of symbols along with what would later be known as the star map, which she later replicated. When she asked where these creatures came from, they were then returned to their car to resume their drive home. So this begs the question, did this happen? Was this the missing time? It agonized the Hills, who simply couldn't tell if this was real or a dream. But something had happened to them, and this would at least account for some of that missing time. But did they risk telling more people? By this point, they'd already contacted the military, who shrugged them off as some sort of crackpot call. But they had the validation of being at least mostly believed by researchers at NICAP, a civilian UFO research group. Okay, yeah. They told people who were already investigating UFO phenomena. Gotta tell somebody though. But do they risk telling their family? Their friends? They could be putting everything on the line. Betty and Barney agonized over this for nearly 2 years, driving back several times to the route they had taken to try to recreate the events of that fateful evening to no avail. Betty felt like she was going crazy. Barney was riddled with stress and anxiety. If they didn't get answers soon, they might snap. They were simply falling apart. The Hills eventually went public about the encounter with their church group in March of 1963, and soon after would find the answers they were looking for, but not from a place they'd expect. As fate would have it, in some roundabout way, the Hills' interest in hypnosis would be piqued after hearing a guest lecture on the subject at their church. They were eventually referred to Dr. Benjamin Simon. He had hoped that with hypnosis, he would be able to treat them and give them the peace they sought at this point for so long. Beginning in 1963, Dr. Simon would have both of the Hills undergo over 6 months of hypnotic regression to uncover the lost memories and finally provide some answers for the missing time. I could tell you more, but I think it's better if we play some clips from these sessions, which confirm that Betty's nightmares and the fragmented memories the Hills had of the event were true. The Hills had been abducted by a UFO and then returned safely to Earth. A warning, the audio is a little disturbing.
We go deeper and deeper, deeper asleep. Far asleep. Deeper and deeper. Fully relaxed, all muscles are relaxed. You're comfortable, relaxed. You will not be anxious or distressed, but you will remember everything and you will tell me everything.
And I'm saying, hurry up, Betty, so I can get a look. And Betty passes the binoculars to me. And I see that this is not a satellite. I think you can see the rows of windows. I want to wake up.
You're not going to wake up. You're in deep sleep. You're comfortable, relaxed. This is not going to trouble you. Go on. You can remember everything now.
It's right over my right. God. What is it? And I try to maintain control so Betty cannot tell I am scared. God, I'm scared.
It's all right. You can go right on, experience it. It will not hurt you now.
I got to get my gun.
All right. All right, that's all. Stop. Go to sleep, Steve. You forget now.
Oh,
You
Lord.
forget it now. You've forgotten. Calm now. Relaxed. Deeply relaxed.
I will also point out that during these hypnosis sessions, Betty recreated the star map that would be shown to her while on board the UFO. This is often considered the smoking gun of the Hills case, and is the subject of incredible amounts of debate and speculation. In 1969, Betty met with Marjorie Fish, an amateur astronomer, schoolteacher, and a Mensa member, who had this to say. On August 4th, 1969, Betty Hill discussed the star map with me. She explained that she drew the map in 1964 under post-hypnotic suggestion. It was to be drawn only if she could remember it accurately, and she was not to pay attention to what she was drawing, which puts it in the realm of automatic drawing. This is a way of getting repressed or forgotten material and can result in unusual accuracy. It was extremely interesting that she was able to draw this while seemingly in a deep hypnotic state, which supposedly resulted in incredible accuracy for a drawing. Fish became obsessed with the star map and eventually managed to establish where the visitor's homeworld was based on the map Betty provided. The Zeta Reticuli system. Whether this is fact or fantasy, it is an interesting piece of evidence that became an extensively debated piece of Hill's story. In 1965, John Luttrell, a reporter from the Boston Evening Traveler, broke the Hills' astonishing story after he was giving audio of them speaking of their encounter to a group along with notes from sessions with investigators, which were supposed to be confidential. Journalistic integrity aside, the genie was now out of the bottle and couldn't be put back in. It began national news with the headline of UFO Chiller, Did They Seize the Couple? Barney sadly died just a few years later in 1969, but Betty lived until 2004, becoming a huge and influential figure of the UFO community. She had finally been able to tell her story, the story of the first documented case of UFO abduction in the United States. It was also told by credible people who hadn't sought any sort of publicity or fame and is at least feasible. Believe what you want about the Hills experience, but the fear, the anxiety, the stress was real. Many described the symptoms they exhibited after as PTSD, and that doesn't just manifest itself. The Hills saw something that night. In the years that followed, we've had dozens, if not hundreds of accounts that describe similar events, but it all started in 1961, with a honeymoon to Niagara Falls on a lonely stretch of road in New England. Thanks to Tinfoil Tom for helping me with this video, and if you want more mysteries, you should check out his channel and watch his videos on the real-life origins of Stranger Things. Tom makes many videos in the same vein as these Grave Stories episodes, and he puts a lot of work into his research, so I suggest checking him out, because if you like these, I'm sure you'll like his videos too. So there you have it, everyone, the infamous case of Betty and Barney Hill's abduction. Thank you for watching. If you liked it, please click the thumbs up. I appreciate everyone who does and everyone who watches and anyone who knows who I am and is still coming around after all these years. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.